I don't know why that mic turned off, but whatever. So what if I did a background removal too? So strange, dude. Alright. I feel like this shit should be lit up like a motherfucker. For some reason it's not. What's going on? Today we're going to be looking at the argument from divine hiddenness. Alright, so today we're going to be looking at the argument from divine hiddenness. So if you're not familiar with the argument, basically it talks about the hiddenness. If you're not familiar with the argument, basically it just... If you're not familiar with the argument, basically it's exactly what it sounds like. Divine being God, hiddenness being hiding. Why is God hiding? It's the basic question. A little bit of context for myself. I am an atheist, meaning I am sort of biased to agree with the argument, but I'll be trying to be as fair as possible. Typically, I'm not really a fan of arguments against the belief in God, like the argument from... what's it called? Pain. So there's two main ones, the argument from suffering and then also the argument from divine hiddenness, which is the one we'll be looking at today. So I'll just get straight into it. This argument, there's a lot of different forms of this argument, but this one is specifically by J.L. Schellenberg. It goes as follows. The argument goes as follows. If a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. Reasonable non-belief does occur, therefore no perfectly loving God exists. So I think to address this argument correctly, I think the most important thing to do first is define our terms. So what does it mean for something to be perfectly loving? And then also, what does reasonable non-belief mean? So first, starting with perfectly loving, I think a simple way of figuring out like what is a perfectly loving God look like is to think of, well, what does a perfectly loving parent look like? God in the Bible is often referenced as the Father. So I mean, God is commonly referenced in the Bible as the Father. So I think we can safely assume two things about a perfectly loving parent. One is that they love each of their children equally, regardless of their actions. And then two is, I think we can safely assume two things about a parent. So one is they love their children equally, regardless of their actions. So even if the child hates them and spits in their face, man, I gotta film more, bro, because this junk is not it, bro. Maybe what I should do is go all the way through with no, like, edits. Act like I can't edit it, and then just go all the way through. Just do a quick little go through. Maybe. Talk about the hiddenness. If you're not familiar with the argument, basically it just maybe it's the Zoom. This does not look good at all. If you're not familiar with the argument, basically it's exactly what it sounds like. Divine being God, hiddenness being hiding. Why is God hiding? That's the basic question. A little bit of context for myself. I am an atheist, meaning I am sort of biased to agree with the argument, but I'll be trying to be as fair as possible. Typically, I'm not really a fan of arguments against the belief in God, like the argument from Cain. So there's two main ones, the argument from suffering and then also the argument from divine hiddenness, which is the one we're looking at today. So I'll just get straight into it. This argument, there's a lot of different forms of this argument, but this one is specifically by J.L. Schellenberg. It goes as follows. The argument goes as follows. If a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. Reasonable non-belief does occur, therefore no perfectly loving God exists. So I think to address this argument correctly, I think the most important thing to do first is define our terms. So what does it mean for something to be perfectly loving? And then also, what does reasonable non-belief mean? So first, starting with perfectly loving, I think a simple way of figuring out like what is a perfectly loving God look like is to think of, okay. Alright, so today we're going to be looking at the argument from divine hiddenness. So for a little bit of context on myself, I am an atheist, so I am a little bit biased to agree with arguments like this, although normally I'm not a fan of arguments against the existence of God. I usually don't think they work. This one I specifically have found very interesting. So this specific argument, there's a lot of different forms of this argument, but this specific one is popularized by J.L. Schellenberg, and I'll just go straight into it. So premise one says, if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. Premise two is that reasonable non-belief occurs, and then the conclusion is that no perfectly loving God exists, following from premise one and two. So I think first and foremost, we got to define terms. So what do we mean by perfectly loving God? And then the other obvious one is, what is reasonable non-belief? So I think starting with perfectly loving God, I think we can sort of compare God to a parent. I mean, he's often referenced as a father in the Bible. So what do we think of when we think of like a perfectly loving parent? I think is a good way to think about this. I think there's two main things that I think of, at least, and that is that are pretty safe to assume. I think most people would agree with this. One is that you love each of your children equally, despite how they treat you. So even if they hate you, they spit in their face, regardless of any of that, you still love each and every one of them equally the same. Your love is unconditional love. Like, basically, I guess that's probably a better way of putting it. So like, no matter how they act, you unconditionally love all of them the same. I think that love is more perfect than if your love was conditional. So, unconditional love. I think it even says that's how God is in the Bible. And then two is I would say a perfectly loving parent seeks to maximize the overall well-being of each of their children. And that's like long-term well-being, their overall well-being, not just immediate. So like, for example, if you wanted to maximize their immediate well-being, you'd give them lots of candy, right? But we know that in the long term, it'd be better if you just didn't give them the candy. So I think those are two safe ones. One, you love each of them unconditionally and equally. And then two is that you maximize their well-being. So going based off those two things, we can look at the premises. So I think it's better to start with reasonable non-belief. Oh, I guess I... Okay, so next, what makes non-belief reasonable? What's not? What's... Okay, so next, what's reasonable non-belief? So I think we can say that reasonable, or at least how J.L. Schellenberg defines it, is that reasonable non-belief is inculpable, meaning you're not to blame for your lack of belief. So an example of this would be a group of people in a dry desert who've never seen rain before, and thus they don't believe that rain exists. Now, we wouldn't blame them for not believing rain doesn't exist, even though it clearly does to us. They have no idea. They've never seen it before. They've never experienced it. So there's not really any reason for them to believe that rain exists. And therefore, we would say that their non-belief is inculpable. They have reasonable non-belief. So I think it's pretty straightforward explanation of what reasonable non-belief is, and then also what perfectly loving God looks like. Only two things for the perfectly loving God. I'm sure there's like a lot of other things that the Bible says, but I think those two are pretty agreeable for everybody. There's no really disagreement. So next, let's look at the premises. So starting with the second premise, so that way we kind of have an idea of what reasonable non-belief is before we go back to the first one, I think would be helpful. I think the idea that, at first glance, the idea that reasonable non-belief occurs is pretty agreeable to most people. I mean, you think of the people in, like, the secluded islands by themselves, like, there's no one else there, they've never heard of God, they've never interacted with people who are talking about God. We wouldn't really expect these people to believe in God. So that's my first thought, and I think that's a lot of people's first thoughts. But then we gotta, what is the counter-argument for this? So the counter-argument, popular one, is that there's tons of evidence of God all around us, and people just choose to ignore it. So I would say maybe there is evidence all around us, but it's not strong enough evidence for everyone to believe. So like you could say like the complexity of the world is a common one that, I mean, it's pretty obvious. Like, all this stuff had to have come from somewhere. Like, everything's super complex. Like, we know that it had to have a creator. Like, sure, this is, like, maybe evidence, but it's not, like, super strong convincing to where someone just thinks about this and they're immediately like, yes, it has to be God. Like, there's a lot you can think of, like, a lot of different ways that this stuff could be the way it is without having to invoke God. And so for that, I don't think it's, like, overwhelming evidence. And so for that, that's not really convincing for me. But let's say that all the people are rejecting it, even though they know that it is true. Like, that is possible, I guess. But the only issue is that in order for that not to be true, for that not to work, you only need one person to be an exception to that rule. And I know that I am the exception to that rule, and so the argument is not really fitting for me. It doesn't really work for me. Because I know that I am not rejecting the evidence. Like, I'm not looking at the evidence and be like, oh, I know that leads to God, and rejecting it. So because I know that I'm not doing that, then, again, that argument doesn't really work for me. So the other argument that people will say is, like, maybe, yes, there are people that are reasonably non-believing in it, but they only came to that because they suppressed the truth over time. Like, at one point, they did believe it was true, and they knew that it was true. Or I'll just say it. At one point, they did know that it was true, and over time, because of their sin, they suppressed the truth so much to where now it feels normal for them to just be like, yeah, I don't really buy that. Like, it doesn't seem as obvious to them, and it's only because they suppressed the truth. And so my first thought is like, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess that could be the case. I could have done that. Like, I know I'm not perfect. I'm not always perfectly rational. I get emotional sometimes about my beliefs. So like, maybe that's the case for me. So now let me think like, okay, what is the issue with this? Is there any issues with this? Like, I guess this could just, I mean, this isn't very satisfying, but it could be true. And then I'm thinking like, okay, well, if this is the case, what am I supposed to do about it? Like, what is the solution to suppression of the truth? Like, how do I get out of this? And apparently the solution is to act like it's true. Even though you don't believe in it, you act like it's true and earnestly search for the truth and look for it. Because if you look for it, you're going to find it. Live like it's true. Live out the Bible. And then it will speak to your heart. I'm like, okay, this still isn't very satisfying, but I guess I can do that. I guess this kind of makes sense. Like, you search for the truth and you'll find it. Like, I guess this makes sense. Until I think again, nobody else lives like this. Like, no Christian lives like this. Nobody lives like this. Like, if we were to actually live this out, like, for example, let's assume Islam is true, right? All of the same arguments that we just used for atheists to their suppression of the truth and how they just need to search it out and they'll find it, the Islam can use the exact same arguments. And yet, those arguments are just as valid, they're equally valid, except for the Christian would never accept that argument from the Islam. The Christian would never search out, even though the argument applies just as equally to them as it does to us and you, like, you would never search out the Islam truth and act like it's true. Like, nobody does this. And in order for this to be applied equally and for everybody to live consistently as if this argument works, then you would have to live and search out every single religion and act like it's true and live like it's true just to see if it speaks with your heart, to see if it actually is true. Like, nobody lives like this. And so for that reason, I'm not gonna lie, it doesn't really, this whole suppression thing is not really working for me because nobody else agrees with it. Like, you can say it is, it's easy to say that, like, just, I'm sure you'll find it. Like, it is true, like, just look for it and you'll find it. Like, no, you're not doing that, nobody else is. So then, like, okay, fine. Let's grant that reasonable non-belief exists. I think this isn't really something that, like, too many people are going to disagree with, like, but let's just assume it exists. But maybe a perfectly loving God would have good reasons to allow for this. I mean, there's a lot of reasons you could come up with, right? Free will being the main one. Like, if God were to force everybody to believe, then free will would not be a thing. Like, God gives us sufficient evidence so that everybody can believe if they want to, but you're not forced to believe. He gives us that freedom, right? That's more perfectly loving to force us to believe, right? Well, I'm going to have to disagree with a lot of assumptions that come with that argument. First, we can grant the argument, and then we have to look at, like, is this argument actually equally applied? Like, for example, in heaven, are we granted the ability to reject God? Because that would make him more loving, right? If allowing us to reject him makes him more loving, then we should have the ability to reject him in heaven, right? Well, no, this isn't the case, and therefore it doesn't really work. Another example would be Jesus, right? If Jesus didn't really have the option to reject God, like he knew that God existed, like he couldn't get out of that. Like, overwhelming evidence was given to Jesus and the angels. Like, the angels in heaven were given knowledge that God existed. And actually, the angels could still reject God. They still had free will, even though they knew that God existed, they still rejected God. and the demons, and that's how we have Satan. So knowledge of God does not get rid of your free will. If anything, I would argue that it actually grants more free will. And I can use a thought experiment to get this point across. So let's say there's a dude that's about to buy drugs, right, at a drugstore. And the guy selling him the drugs has future knowledge. Like, he can see the future of everybody who buys the drugs. So before the guy buys the drugs, he shows him his future. He says, all right, before you buy these drugs, let me show you something. So this is exactly what your drug experience is going to look like. So he sees how amazing the drug experience is going to be like, and it's good. So he's like, cool. And then he shows what his life is going to be after he does those drugs. And it's a bunch of torture and agony he's constantly in. He has a failed marriage. He has kids, but he never gets to see them again. He ends up under a bridge, starving to death. And then he dies alone. But then he shows him also, hey, this is your life if you don't do drugs. And he has a great career. He has a great relationship with his wife, an amazing relationship with his kids, and he dies of old age. And the dude looks at both scenarios, but he sees his great drug experience, and he's like, wow, I didn't know that this is the reality of the drugs. I had no idea. Like, I only knew a small portion of what's actually true about these drugs. I didn't see the whole picture. And so after he sees the whole picture, he walks out of the store and doesn't buy the drugs. And he never does drugs for the rest of his life. And with that story, you can kind of see that we wouldn't say that the dude selling him the drugs forced him to not do the drugs. Like, he had the option. He saw what was going to happen, and he could do whatever he wanted. He saw he saw the consequences for whatever decision he chose, and he chose the one that would result in his life being better. And I think in that situation, he like exerted more free will in making that decision. He didn't exert less free will. He had more freedom because he had more information. He knew more about what he was doing. Like, for example, if the dude's about to eat some candy and there's drugs like mixed in with the candy that's gonna kill him, like, and then he eats the drugs, like, he then dies. Like, we would say that he did not freely choose to do those drugs. Like, he had a misunderstanding. And so knowing less information, we tend to think goes with less free will, and knowing more information tends to go with more freedom. So I don't know why in the situation with God it would be different. Okay, so let's say it's not for free will's sake, but the reason that God does it is to grow people's character and virtues. This is known as the soul-building theodicy. Maybe Christians who struggle with their faith end up growing more virtuous as a result. We would prefer these Christians. They're greater than Christians who have just been Christian their whole life without ever considering it not being true, right? And I don't think that it makes sense to claim that the lack of belief grows stronger Christian. It allows for more growth in virtues and character. When we look at the most virtuous man that has ever existed is Jesus, and he never dealt with lack of belief. So would we say that Jesus' life would be more virtuous if he struggled with believing in God? I don't think we would say that, no. So it's not necessary for building character, considering the strongest character to ever exist never struggled with belief in God. If anything, that is an argument that you will have a stronger character if you always knew that God existed. Okay, so then the third argument that I found was the idea of God remaining hidden to maximize greater goods being achieved. So not necessarily people being better, but just the overall goods that exist in the world are greater when he's hidden versus if he's aware and available to everybody. So I think First, okay, so the third argument that I've seen is that God remains hidden for the greater good of everybody, the greater good to the Odyssey. And my issue with this is pretty clearly that this conflicts with how we define perfectly loving, because perfectly loving is to love each individual equally and seek to maximize each of their well-beings equally. And so when we're sacrificing certain people by remaining hidden from them for the greater good of everybody, this just doesn't really, it doesn't really connect very well. It's confusing because it's like, what are these greater goods that are being achieved? Like, to me, it seems like any good that can be achieved with lack of belief can also be achieved with belief. Like, I'm thinking of like all the goods that can only be achieved with lack of belief, and the only good that I can think of is the good of going from not believing to believing. Like, that transition from not believing to believing is the only good I can think of. And if we're optimizing for that, then we would expect, again, to see this everywhere. Or we would even just expect to see, like, people continuously believing and not believing and then believing and then not believing and then believing, because this would be, like, way better, right? Or we'd at least, at the very bare minimum, expect to see this in each individual person, right? But we, again, do not see it in the perfect human being Jesus. Are we saying he's less good because he never went from not believing to believing? I don't think we would say this. So to summarize my positions, I looked at basically all the arguments that I could find in response to divine hiddenness, and I don't think any of them work. So to summarize, for premise one, the arguments that either God loves us more by giving us free will, or that non-belief is actually preferable because it leads to something greater. So my response to free will is, first, there's no free will to reject God in heaven, but also God instilling knowledge does not force us to choose him. For example, Satan and the demons, their knowledge did not force them to choose God. But instead, that actually, the knowledge gives us more freedom to choose what we want. And I think that this, I forgot to talk about this earlier, but I think this would actually result in more people choosing him. Like the example with the drug person, like when you have the all-encompassing information and you know everything, you'd have the freedom to make a different decision if you'd like, but you would still end up choosing this decision that you think would be best for you. And if you're fully informed, that decision would always be God. So I don't think we'd see people rejecting him if you had the full all-encompassing picture. So God can still achieve his goals by giving us that knowledge. And then the issue with saying that non-belief is preferable is pretty much mostly just because it's inconsistent with Jesus. We would see non-belief in Jesus if the argument is that non-belief is preferable to just always having belief. The argument against premise 2 is essentially that there is enough evidence and we just need to be more open to it and live out the truth. My response to that is that it's an unreasonable expectation, because this line of thinking would be equally applied to every single other religion, and obviously people do not apply it to every religion. We see that every day, that no one does that. And so if we can say that it doesn't apply to all these other religions, then we would be consistent in also saying that it does not apply to atheism. And so for all those reasons, I do think the argument for divine hiddenness still works. I'm not married to the argument. I'm happy to change my mind if I find more compelling arguments against it. And there's still tons that I don't know. Like, I don't know the common responses to my arguments and my responses to the other arguments. I don't really know what the response is to what I said. So I am still trying to learn. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. And that was my review for the argument of divine hiddenness. Come in! Nah, bro, I was recording a video.
Let me in, bro.
Let me in. No one's home, bro.
Well, I didn't know that.
Well, now you know.